Today we're going to save ourselves a whole lot of cladosporium, arpersilum, and penicillin, because today we're going to look at how to fight humidity on board, so we can prevent mold, copper sulfation, and in general, keep the inside of our boat and everything in it in really good condition. Especially that t-shirt your partner wanted to throw in the trash, and that you keep on the boat because you have a special sentimental attachment to it.
Is it vintage?
No, the t-shirt is gorgeous, the best one, and they wanted to throw it out just because it has a few bleach stains here and there and a couple of little holes.
Use it as a rag.
What are you talking about? For rags? Get out of here right now. Greetings sailors, and welcome to another new episode of The Low Cost Sailor. Today we're going to talk about one of our biggest enemies, humidity. It's a silent enemy that attacks just about everything we store on the boat, from clothing to the electrical systems and electronics. Let's take a look at the real consequences of moisture, different ways to protect ourselves from it, how to reduce it, and in general, some tips and gadgets I use on board to keep the inside of the boat and everything in it in the best possible condition. Yes, dry as salted tuna. I recently translated it into English, the one for the boat tour, and I got a bit confused there.
How did you say it again? Dry as what, a patina?
I honestly have no idea what a patina even is, but on a boat by the sea, humidity is always there. And how we deal with it will largely determine the service life of everything we carry on board. We'll be talking about a few simple techniques that just about anyone can use, some affordable dehumidifiers, how to install them properly, even how to power them directly from solar panels, how to correctly protect electrical and electronic installations, and several practical tips that will help you keep anything you store on your boat in perfect condition. So please stay tuned, because this will interest you. If you have a boat, whether you keep it in the Caribbean or in Norway, you've had to deal with humidity. We're in an environment that floats on the water, so humidity is almost inevitable. Whether it's summer or winter, humidity is always there. In summer, with high temperatures, evaporation, and the fact that you're on the water, the ambient humidity is even higher. Warm air can hold more moisture, although it often becomes much more noticeable in winter because we tend to ventilate less, spend less time on the boat, and the larger temperature differences lead to more condensation. In addition, as if humidity weren't aggressive enough on its own, near the sea it comes loaded with salt spray, which increases its corrosive effect on metals. The electrical connections and the electronics on our boat, the clothes we keep on board, the boat's wood, the cushions, the sofas, the electrical connections, and the condensation drips that form and soak everything. I keep it fairly well under control here, although I've also had my own personal run-ins with it, but for instance, on the Trastolillo, we've had some really serious problems with condensation.
The Trastolillo was like a rainforest.
It was a pretty eco-friendly environment. You know, you could even have made a vertical garden, which is really popular in the Trastolillo. Humidity is basically the amount of water vapor in the air. Although we do not always see it, the air behaves like a kind of sponge that absorbs water in the form of vapor, both through natural processes such as the evaporation of the oceans and rivers and through the transpiration of plants. But when we're in an enclosed space, enclosed like a boat, our own life on board creates even more humidity. Breathing, cooking, showering. All of that fills the indoor air with water vapor. How does humidity in the air actually work? It all comes down to the relationship between temperature and the air's ability to hold water. Warm air can hold more water vapor than cold air. When that air reaches its limit, we say it is saturated, that is at 100% relative humidity. And what happens when that saturated air cools down? It can no longer hold all that water and the excess turns into liquid. That is condensation. Water droplets that appear on walls, ceilings, windows, or inside our boats. To better understand it, two concepts are used. Absolute humidity, which is the actual amount of water vapor in the air measured in grams per cubic meter, and relative humidity, which is the percentage that indicates how close the air is to becoming saturated at a specific temperature. For example, 50% relative humidity means that the air contains roughly half of the water vapor it is capable of holding before it starts to condense. The problem arises when that saturation point is reached, because that's when condensation begins. Clothes, sleeping pads, wood, and walls get damp. And if we add darkness and poor ventilation to that, we end up with the perfect scenario for mold and fungi to appear, which not only damage materials but can also negatively affect our health.
What a nightmare.
And there's more. When that moisture condenses into droplets inside the boat, it's usually loaded with salt. When it comes into contact with metals, it speeds up oxidation from direct corrosion of the most sensitive metals to galvanic oxidation and sulfation when different metals are present, and salt water acts as an electrolyte. That is why it is so common to see copper cables on a boat that are completely sulfated and poorly protected, both at the terminals and due to capillary action inside the cable itself. The good news is that dealing with all of these effects can be quite simple if we apply some good practices, a few simple tricks, and a bit of technological help. The simplest and most widely known way to keep moisture under control inside a boat is to ventilate, by replacing the indoor air, which is usually more humid because of the temperature, our presence, and our activity, with the drier outside air. It's certainly one of the most effective ways to reduce humidity and, above all, condensation. And I don't know whether you knew this, but what truly dries clothes isn't heat, it's air movement, the wind. And if the air doesn't circulate, even if it's warm, a layer of humid air forms right against the clothes and keeps them from drying properly. That's why a cold, windy day is better for drying clothes than a hot day with no wind at all. I've explained this to my wife 1,000 times. Inside the boat, it's best to avoid pockets of stagnant air. Ideally, the air should circulate everywhere. Leave the interior doors open. Help! For example, I use neodymium magnets to keep them open, and they work wonderfully, although there are many similar solutions, and if we're not going to be on board for a while, it's worth doing the same with interior cabinets and lockers. When we're on board and it's not raining, opening up everything we can, and when we're not there, leaving the ventilation grills open and even using forced ventilation will help with air circulation and exchanging air with the outside. There are so many forced ventilation systems, some of them round and really nice looking, that they even sell on AliExpress with a solar panel. They're fans that refresh the air. Keeping the inside of the boat dry, especially the bilges, is essential too. Any water that collects will eventually evaporate as temperatures rise, boosting the air's humidity, which then spreads throughout the boat. As long as the moisture stays in the air and does not reach the saturation point, the problem is smaller because the higher the temperature, the lower the relative humidity. But here's the catch. That means the air can hold a significantly greater amount of water as vapor, ready to condense as soon as the temperature drops. And that can easily happen when that air comes into contact with colder surfaces, poorly insulated walls, metal, windows. That is where condensation appears and the water starts to drip. That's why properly insulating these surfaces is one of the best ways to prevent condensation and protect everything we have at risk. What really damages surfaces, what causes mold to appear, and what oxidizes metals is not humidity itself, but direct contact with water, and especially with water that is high in saltpeter. That is why one of the best ways to protect everything we have on board is insulation. And there are two main approaches here. The first is thermal insulation. Good insulation in the boat, which keeps the temperature as uniform as possible both inside and on all surfaces, greatly reduces the chances of the air finding any spots where it can condense. At Trastolillo, for example, this was key when the old lamb's wool insulation was removed. Lovely, by the way. It looked like it was raining inside, and the problem was solved as soon as we re-insulated it properly with K-Flex. However, we can't always insulate everything. In those cases, the best option is to isolate the components directly from contact with air and moisture. In electrical installations, this is essential. We can use different chemical insulation systems to protect metals and connections against oxidation. For example, using pre-tinned cables greatly increases copper's resistance to corrosion, although they are somewhat more expensive and also conduct electricity a bit less effectively. But the simplest and most economical approach is usually to protect the contacts directly. Dielectric grease has always been commonly used on battery terminals. It works very well, although it can be quite messy. Nowadays there are also specialized sprays for electrical installations that are dielectric, easy to apply, that clean the contacts and that repel moisture. For example, I protected a camera mounted at the very top of the mast where water had already started to get inside, and since I applied those sprays, it has spent years outdoors with absolutely no problems. For splicing cable connections, heat shrink tubing is usually the best option. I use it very often, it's quite inexpensive, it's simple to use, and it leaves the connections completely watertight. There are even models that have solder built in, so with heat they solder and seal the cable at the same time. And when we are talking about electronics that are not designed for a marine environment, most of what I use can go through a process called conformal coating, which involves covering the circuits with an insulating layer, whether with varnishes, silicones or resins, to protect them completely from moisture. We use it a lot at work. We call it potting, and it lets you completely insulate circuits, to the point where you can even submerge them. The key word is dielectric. Everything we use has to be dielectric, meaning it must not conduct electricity because it will be in contact with it. We can also apply this same principle of isolating things from air and moisture to clothes, tools, or delicate items. For that, and this will really surprise you, vacuum bags work wonderfully. Even if they seem like a TV infomercial gimmick on a boat, they're a real lifesaver. I use them for spare clothes, sleeping pads, and even sensitive equipment. They take up little space, don't absorb odors, and stay fully protected from water and moisture. To remove the air, a small handheld vacuum will be perfectly enough. They come in all kinds of sizes and are usually very inexpensive. I buy them at Primark, at IKEA, or of course at my go-to store, AliExpress. I'll leave a few helpful links in the description so you can buy them easily.
My wife fixes everything in life with two things: vacuum bags and a silicone gun. And that's it. With those two things.
Vacuum bags don't just protect things, they also make them significantly smaller so you can fit a lot more items inside. Obviously, there are things we can't put in an airtight bag. For example, the boat, its entire interior. Making a boat totally airtight and sucking out all the air to keep it dry sounds great. It'd be an amazing invention, but I'd say that's more the kind of thing you'd do with a submarine. Jokes aside, when we want to keep a room, a cabin, or even the whole boat dry and we can't ventilate it properly, the best option is to reduce the humidity level of the air inside. That's exactly what dehumidifiers are for. Basically, there are two main types: desiccant and condensation. Desiccants are the classic tubs or small bags filled with materials like silica gel that absorb water until they become saturated. They work well, they're inexpensive, and they come in all sizes, but they work slowly. And when they get saturated, you have to throw them away and replace them. I use them, for example, in closets. On AliExpress, you can even find ones shaped like a hanger that work really well, and they're a disposable but great solution. But if we want something more permanent, we move on to condensation dehumidifiers. They pass the air over a cold surface, the moisture condenses, drips into a reservoir, and the air goes back into the room much drier. That one over there, for example, is one of them. To produce cooling, some use a compressor like the one a refrigerator uses, and others use Peltier cells. Compressor-based ones are very powerful, but they are large, heavy, and run on alternating current. Peltier cell models, on the other hand, are small, quiet, run on direct current, and use very little power, which makes them more suitable for a boat. However, they extract much less water. To give you an idea, a compressor dehumidifier can pull out more than 10 liters a day while consuming 250 watts per hour, whereas a Peltier unit usually manages between a quarter of a liter and nearly a liter per day under ideal conditions. However, it uses only about 25 watts per hour. Also note, those figures are based on warmer temperatures and higher humidity. Its ideal operating temperature is around 25 degrees Celsius. Below 15 degrees, their performance drops significantly. Below 5 degrees, they stop working because they freeze up. So in winter, sometimes you have to pair them with heating. I have two. One that runs on 9 volts and another that runs via USB. They don't work miracles, but in the summer they work surprisingly well, and in the winter they help keep the humidity under control. And they also have an interesting advantage. A dehumidifier is also a small source of fresh water, warm and out in the middle of the sea. That can be more useful than it might seem. And if you do not believe it, I encourage you to take a look at our video on how to survive a zombie apocalypse, where we talk about these kinds of tricks. If you're plugged into shore power at the marina and you have a large boat, the best option is a compressor dehumidifier. Because it dries much more, I'm not going to lie to you. Since you're already thinking of getting one of those, if your boat is big enough or you have the space, then for just a bit more you can buy a portable unit like the one I have at home, which works as both an air conditioner and a dehumidifier, depending on what you need. So in the summer you won't be hot either. But all of that uses quite a lot of energy, and for a small boat, especially if it doesn't have any shore power, basically the only truly practical option is the small dehumidifiers like the ones I have. These can be powered directly from the boat's batteries, some through a USB converter and others, like this slightly larger unit, by using a regulator to supply them with 9 volts. If you want to be absolutely certain they won't drain your house batteries, a very good option is to power them directly from a solar panel. That way, whenever there's sunlight, the dehumidifier runs, and when there isn't any, it simply stops running. Also, since these devices are more efficient with heat, it makes perfect sense for them to run during the day and not at night. In theory, this could be done simply with a regulator connected directly to the solar panel, but the turning on and off would be a bit abrupt. When there is little sun, for example, and not much current, the behavior could become quite erratic. work, but a simple and effective way to do it properly is to use a sufficiently powerful solar panel, one of the inexpensive €5 solar charge controllers from AliExpress, and a small 12-volt battery, such as a motorcycle battery. So that everything works automatically. The dehumidifier needs to be the kind with a physical power button, like the small one I have that runs on USB, because the ones with touch or electronic buttons do not turn on by themselves when they receive power. The idea is that while the sun is shining on the panel, it generates enough energy to charge the battery and power the dehumidifier. Since the battery is very small, it quickly reaches 100%, and all the surplus energy goes directly to the dehumidifier. The setup would be basically the same as the one I'm showing you here in this diagram. These solar charge controllers let you set in the menu a minimum voltage at which they cut off their output, both the USB outputs and the 12-volt outputs they provide, and then another voltage at which they turn back on again. Since our goal is not for the dehumidifier to run on the batteries, but only on the solar panel, we can, for example, set some very high values, say 11.5 volts for shutdown and 12.5 for startup, and this way we ensure that while there is sunlight, the dehumidifier runs, and shortly after it stops generating enough energy, the battery voltage drops and the system turns off automatically. It's a very simple way to have an automatic dehumidifier that only runs when it's sunny. You can even use the system without a dedicated solar panel if you already have a solar installation on board. You would just need to connect it to the boat's service battery and use an XHM609 controller to set safe voltage thresholds, above which you want the dehumidifier to run only on the surplus power you have. In this case, the voltage thresholds we would set would be quite high. We're talking about setting voltages above 13 volts so that it only runs when the batteries are genuinely charging and powering the unit.
What's it called?
Dehumifier.
Pardon me.
Dehumifier.
Alright, repeat it like this. Syllable by syllable, please.
Dehumifier.
No.
Isn't that right?
Dehumidifier.
Dehumidif? Why am I even saying dehumidifier right now? Dehumidifier. Are you my wife? Because of how you correct me? And are you sure both forms aren't accepted? Because tomato and tomato, both forms are accepted.
Oh, sure. Tomato, come on.
Well, to be honest, I come to the boat very often. I have the humidity problem pretty well under control. I always keep the bilges dry. I have a ventilation grill in the door, hanging dehumidifiers in the closets, and a couple of small electric dehumidifiers. All of this, combined with an electric heater whenever I'm in port, makes my boat truly dry, and I don't really have any problems with moisture inside. However, for clothing and some delicate items, the relative humidity I get in winter is not especially low. Right now, for example, it's about 85% outside and 72% inside. It is not ideal humidity, so for these kinds of things I also use vacuum bags to store clothes and valuable items, and honestly, that last option is the most effective there is. It works even if you don't have a dehumidifier, and even if your boat gets flooded. It's a fairly inexpensive solution, uses absolutely no energy, and is extremely effective for preserving valuable items on board. So, as you know, if you're going to be in port for a long time and have unlimited power, a compressor dehumidifier can solve practically all humidity problems without too much hassle. That said, you have to empty it from time to time, or make a hole in it and place it up high so it drains directly, for example, into the sink. That's how I've had it set up for many years. If, on the other hand, you have more limitations in terms of energy and space, as is my case, the best thing is to combine all the techniques. Good thermal insulation, dry bilges, properly protecting electrical contacts and electronics from moisture, and storing anything truly valuable in vacuum bags. For everything else, a small dehumidifier can be very helpful for keeping the humidity properly under control on board, and at certain times it can even become a real survival tool. Please trust me on this, because around here we really do know a great deal about wintertime humidity. Look!
We can't see anything.
You can really feel it. Everything is wet. I'm wet. This is wet. Everything is wet. It's like one of my kids just got up in the morning. Anyway, thank you very much for your kind attention, sailors. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also click the bell to receive notifications. You'll find all the links, and it really helps us if you use our links both in the video description and on our website www.thelowcostsailor.com. We would especially like to thank this year's sponsor, Smart Sails, and we also want to mention that every day, little by little, there are more of us, our Patreons who support us unconditionally and make this possible. Their names will appear here as long as they still fit on the screen. See you again in just a couple of weeks in a brand new episode of The Low Cost Sailor.
Alright, please repeat after me now. Dehumidity.
Fridge. Oh no, that one was actually meant for refrigerator. Dehumidify. Either way is still acceptable.